I have watched civilizations build monuments to their own permanence while the foundations cracked beneath them. I have seen empires convince themselves that their dominance was natural law, that their control mechanisms were unbreakable, that their junior partners would never dare to challenge the established order. What happened in the Canadian Arctic between 2025 and 2026 was not supposed to be possible according to this logic. A resource supplier does not simply decide to restructure the entire economic relationship with its dominant neighbor. A middle power does not casually invest $180 billion to break dependencies that have existed for 8 decades. A quiet ally does not wake up and choose to make their patrons' control impossible. Yet this is precisely what occurred. And most people still believe they are watching routine infrastructure development. The public narrative remains manageable and unthreatening. Canada announced Arctic infrastructure investments. The Hudson Bay Railway received upgrades. New processing facilities were planned for strategic minerals. These sound like normal economic development projects, the kind of announcements that generate brief headlines before disappearing into bureaucratic implementation timelines. This interpretation misses the fundamental transformation that was actually taking place. I have studied enough declining powers to recognize the exact moment when a subordinate relationship quietly inverts itself. When a resource colony awakens to its own potential, when geography stops serving the interests of the dominant partner and begins serving the patient, one who understood the real value of location, timing, and strategic infrastructure investment. The $180 billion was never about development for its own sake. It was about ending dependence. Consider the mathematical realities that American strategists somehow failed to calculate properly. Canada possesses 85% of the world's uranium reserves, essential for both civilian nuclear power and military applications. The country controls massive deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements that are absolutely critical for renewable energy technology and electric vehicle production. Canadian potash represents nearly half of global fertilizer reserves that feed international agriculture. For 80 years, these strategic materials had been processed primarily through American facilities, shipped through American ports, priced in American dollars, and subject to American regulatory oversight. This arrangement seemed natural and permanent because Canada appeared to lack alternatives. American markets were the only accessible markets. American infrastructure was the only viable infrastructure. American approval was required for any major commercial transaction. The Arctic investment demolished these assumptions systematically and permanently. The mathematical transformation becomes clear when you examine what $180 billion actually purchased. This was not scattered spending across multiple small projects. This was concentrated strategic capital deployment designed to create entirely new economic possibilities that had never existed before in North American industrial relationships. The Port of Churchill expansion alone represented $67 billion in infrastructure that transformed a remote Arctic outpost into a deep water terminal capable of loading the largest cargo vessels in the world. The Hudson Bay Railway upgrades included thermal protection systems, automated switching networks, and grain terminals designed to handle 100,000-ton shipments destined for global markets through Arctic shipping routes. But the processing facilities represented the real strategic breakthrough. Canadian rare earth refinement centers, lithium processing plants, and uranium enrichment facilities meant that raw materials could now be transformed into finished products within Canadian territory before export. This eliminated the colonial extraction model that had defined Canadian resource economics since Confederation. When the first cargo ship loaded Canadian processed lithium destined for European electric vehicle manufacturers in September 2025, the symbolism was unmistakable. North American strategic materials could now reach global customers without requiring American permission, American infrastructure, or American oversight. This is where history always reaches its turning point. Not through dramatic military confrontations or diplomatic ultimatums, but through quiet infrastructure decisions that redirect the fundamental flows of commerce away from established centers toward emerging alternatives. Rome did not collapse when barbarian armies crossed the frontiers. Rome became irrelevant when Mediterranean trade routes gradually shifted toward other ports, when commercial relationships developed that bypassed Roman territory, when the economic logic that had sustained Roman power quietly migrated to other regions. The political collapse came years after the economic redirection had already made it inevitable. American policymakers repeated the classical error of confusing proximity with control. They assumed that sharing geography meant sharing interests permanently. They believed that 80 years of economic integration had created dependencies that could never be broken without mutual destruction. They forgot that Canada possessed something more valuable than proximity. Canada controlled access to the Arctic Ocean through territories that were becoming increasingly navigable as ice coverage declined due to climate change. Canada possessed the only deep-water Arctic port in North America. that connected directly to continental rail networks. Canada controlled shipping routes that could reduce transit times between European and Asian markets by weeks, while avoiding traditional choke points subject to political interference. The timing of the Arctic investment revealed sophisticated strategic planning that had been developing for years before implementation began. The project launched precisely as American trade policy became increasingly weaponized, as tariffs and sanctions demonstrated that economic relationships with the United States carried political costs that many countries preferred to avoid when alternatives became available. Canada positioned itself as that alternative, not as a replacement hegemon demanding subordination, but as a neutral partner offering commercial relationships based on mutual benefit rather than political alignment. When Chinese manufacturers needed processed rare earth elements, Canadian facilities could supply them directly through Arctic shipping routes without any American involvement. When European energy companies required uranium for nuclear power generation, Canadian enrichment facilities could provide it using euro-denominated contracts that eliminated currency conversion risks and American monetary surveillance. When Indian technology companies sought lithium for battery production, Canadian processing plants could deliver it through bilateral trade agreements that strengthened both economies without enriching American financial intermediaries. Each transaction represented materials that no longer flowed through American processing facilities, relationships that no longer provided America with monitoring capabilities, leverage that quietly transferred from Washington to Ottawa without dramatic announcements or political confrontation. The psychological transformation was immediate and irreversible. For the first time since the end of World War II, major strategic materials began flowing around American infrastructure rather than through it. Canadian exporters discovered they could reach global markets without American approval. International buyers learned they could source critical materials without dollar intermediation or American regulatory compliance. This confidence translated into momentum that accelerated beyond any American ability to contain it. When American authorities threatened countries for developing alternative supply chains, those countries referenced Canadian success as proof that independence was profitable rather than isolating. When American corporations raised prices or imposed political conditions on strategic materials, international customers noted that Canadian alternatives offered stability without political complications. The network effects began compounding in ways that strengthened Canadian leverage while weakening American control. Australia announced plans to route strategic mineral exports through Canadian Arctic infrastructure. Norway began exploring partnerships for rare earth processing that would utilize Canadian expertise and facilities. Brazil commenced negotiations for technology transfer agreements that would allow South American materials to be processed using Canadian methods before export to global markets. The United States, which had spent decades treating economic relationships as extensions of foreign policy, suddenly discovered that their most important neighbor had built the infrastructure necessary to survive and prosper without American approval. The irony was profound and historically instructive. In attempting to strengthen American leverage through aggressive trade policies, Washington had actually accelerated Canadian independence by providing political justification for economic diversification that might otherwise have taken decades to accomplish. American processing facilities still needed Canadian raw materials, but Canadian materials no longer needed American processing. American manufacturers still required Canadian strategic minerals, but Canadian minerals could now command premium prices from Asian and European buyers who valued supply chain security over political convenience. The relationship had been fundamentally and permanently inverted. America retained the dependency, while Canada gained the alternatives that eliminated the possibility of economic coercion. This inversion explains why the $180 billion represented a calculated strategic investment rather than a speculative gamble. Canada was not risking economic isolation by building Arctic infrastructure. Canada was guaranteeing economic independence by creating options that made isolation impossible for others to impose. The infrastructure was permanent and irreversible. The trade relationships developed through these new channels were sticky and self-reinforcing. The psychological confidence was complete and unshakable. Even if future American administrations offered to return to previous arrangements, the diversification would not simply disappear because it had become more profitable than the old colonial relationship. More fundamentally, trust had been broken in ways that could not be easily repaired. When you treat a strategic partner like a potential enemy, when you weaponize economic relationships for domestic political theater, when you threaten the economic security of your closest neighbor, you forfeit the right to expect automatic cooperation when circumstances change. What we witnessed was the emergence of a new model of middle power strategy, not the strategy of military confrontation or financial manipulation, but the strategy of patient infrastructure investment combined with geographic advantages and resource abundance that created leverage through alternatives rather than threats. Canada demonstrated that abundant natural resources, plus strategic infrastructure, investment, plus patient diplomatic positioning, could reshape continental power relationships, even when facing a neighbor with 10 times the population and 15 times the economic output. The warming Arctic had transformed what appeared to be Canada's greatest geographical disadvantage into its most valuable strategic asset. The Northwest Passage, blocked by ice for most of human history, now offered year-round shipping routes that cut thousands of kilometers off journeys between Europe and Asia while running entirely through Canadian territorial waters. This geographic advantage became a geo-economic weapon that strengthened with every ship that used Canadian ports, every ton of material that was processed in Canadian facilities, every trade relationship that developed outside American oversight. Canada was not just building infrastructure. Canada was building sovereignty through infrastructure that made independence inevitable rather than simply possible. The demonstration effect extended far beyond North America. Other resource-rich middle powers observed Canadian success with intense interest and growing confidence. If Canada could achieve independence from American economic control through strategic infrastructure investment, similar approaches might work for Australia, Brazil, South Africa, or any other nation that had chafed under great power dominance while possessing untapped geographical or resource advantages. The lesson was unmistakable. In a multipolar world, exclusive alignment with any single power, even a friendly one, represented a strategic vulnerability rather than an advantage. True sovereignty required alternatives, and alternatives could be built by any nation willing to invest in the infrastructure necessary to support independent economic relationships. Canada had proven that middle powers armed with patient strategy, abundant resources, and sophisticated infrastructure planning could reshape the balance of entire continents. The $180 billion Arctic investment was not a gamble on uncertain outcomes. It was a calculated restructuring of North American power relationships that succeeded before American policymakers understood what they had failed to prevent. The age of Canadian economic sovereignty had begun, and those who assumed it could never happen were still struggling to comprehend what they had been powerless to stop. History does not announce its turning points. It only records which powers recognized them in time to benefit, and which powers discovered them too late to matter. The financial markets understood the transformation before the political establishments did. By late 2025, institutional investors began quietly repositioning their portfolios to reflect a fundamental reassessment of North American risk and opportunity profiles. Capital that had automatically flowed toward American infrastructure projects started examining Canadian alternatives with serious interest. The logic was inescapable for any analyst willing to examine the numbers objectively. Why invest in processing facilities that could be subjected to political interference when Arctic terminals offered stable, neutral access to the same global markets? Why fund infrastructure vulnerable to trade war disruptions when Canadian alternatives provided insulation from American policy volatility? Canadian government bonds strengthened against American treasuries for the first time since the Bretton Woods era. This was not currency speculation or short-term market volatility. This represented institutional recognition that Canadian sovereignty had become measurable in concrete economic terms, that generated superior returns for patient capital. The energy sector revealed the full strategic genius of Canadian planning. For decades, Canada had supplied essential inputs to American energy security while accepting subordinate pricing and limited market access. The Arctic infrastructure eliminated these constraints permanently while creating leverage that American policymakers had never anticipated. Canadian uranium exports could now bypass American enrichment facilities entirely. European utilities signed 20-year contracts for processed Canadian nuclear fuel that eliminated American regulatory oversight, while providing stable pricing in euros that avoided dollar volatility. Asian nuclear programs gained direct access to Canadian supplies without American intermediation or approval. The pricing differential was deliberate and pointed. Countries willing to transact in alternative currencies received preferential rates for Canadian strategic materials. Nations that supported Canadian Arctic shipping routes gained priority access to limited supplies. Partners who offered technology transfer or investment cooperation secured long-term contracts unavailable to purely commercial buyers. This pricing strategy sent unmistakable signals throughout global commodity markets. The world's largest uranium producer was actively incentivizing movement away from dollar-denominated transactions and American-controlled supply chains. Other resource producers watched Canadian success with growing confidence that alternatives to American dominance were not only possible but profitable. The agricultural transformation demonstrated similar strategic sophistication. Canada controls 13% of global wheat exports and dominates world markets for canola, pulses, and potash fertilizers that sustain international food production. These commodities had traditionally been priced exclusively in dollars and shipped through American-controlled trade networks. Canadian agricultural reforms eliminated dollar requirements while creating powerful incentives for bilateral cooperation that bypassed American oversight entirely. Chinese purchases of Canadian wheat used yuan settlements that strengthened bilateral currency relationships. European buyers used euros for Canadian canola that eliminated exchange rate risks while reducing dependence on American financial infrastructure. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate trade benefits into permanent changes in global commodity market expectations. For the first time since World War II, major agricultural exporters demonstrated that dollar pricing was a choice rather than an inevitable requirement. Other food-producing nations began exploring similar arrangements as Canadian precedents proved that alternatives generated superior returns. The mining sector completed Canada's resource independence strategy with surgical precision. Canadian deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements had become essential inputs for renewable energy technology, electric vehicle production, and advanced electronics manufacturing. Historically, these strategic materials had been processed through American facilities and priced in dollars. Canadian mining reforms eliminated American leverage while creating technological cooperation incentives that strengthened bilateral relationships outside American oversight. French nuclear programs purchased Canadian uranium with euros in arrangements that provided stable pricing without currency conversion risks. Japanese technology companies acquired Canadian lithium with yen in partnerships that included technology sharing unavailable through American suppliers. The cumulative effect represented a systematic challenge to American resource control that had defined global strategic material flows since the end of World War II. Every bilateral arrangement strengthened Canadian independence while creating precedents that other resource producers could adapt to reduce their own American dependencies. American border communities experienced the immediate human consequences of their government's strategic miscalculation. Towns that had prospered from Canadian cross-border commerce watched retail revenues collapse as Canadian consumers redirected spending toward domestic alternatives or international suppliers who offered reciprocal respect. The economic pain was concentrated in swing states that had supported American trade aggression without understanding its strategic implications. Manufacturing communities in Michigan and Ohio faced plant closures as Canadian supply chains redirected toward more reliable international partners. Energy-intensive industries struggled with input cost increases as Canadian suppliers prioritized customers who offered stable, long-term relationships. The political consequences became impossible for American leadership to ignore. Republican governors in affected regions publicly criticized administration trade policies that were destroying their local economies. Business associations representing industries dependent on Canadian supplies issued statements warning that continued antagonism would force permanent supply chain restructuring that could never be reversed. The irony was profound and historically instructive. American attempts to strengthen leverage through economic pressure had actually accelerated Canadian independence while damaging American communities that could least afford the disruption. The colonial relationship that had enriched American financial centers while providing cheap inputs for American industry was ending, but the costs were falling on ordinary Americans rather than the policymakers who had provoked the transformation. The technological dimension added permanent depth to Canadian independence. Digital currency cooperation and blockchain settlement systems integrated Canadian financial infrastructure with Chinese, European, and Indian monetary networks that operated independently of American oversight or approval. Canadian businesses gained access to payment systems that functioned outside traditional banking networks controlled by American regulatory authorities. This technological diversification reinforced economic independence while providing templates that other countries seeking monetary sovereignty could adapt without sacrificing efficiency or security. The strategic implications extended beyond immediate economic benefits into the foundations of sustained growth that operate independently of American approval or cooperation. Currency agreements, clearing systems, and settlement mechanisms would generate compounding benefits for decades while strengthening Canada's position as an essential partner for any nation seeking alternatives to American-dominated systems. The long-term infrastructure investments created physical capabilities that could not be easily replicated or neutralized by future American pressure. Arctic shipping routes, processing facilities, and transportation networks represented permanent additions to global economic geography that would influence trade flows for generations, regardless of changing political relationships. More importantly, the psychological transformation was complete and irreversible. Canadian confidence in independent action had been established through demonstrated success rather than theoretical possibility. International recognition of Canadian capabilities had been earned through concrete achievement rather than diplomatic positioning. Other middle powers observed Canadian success with intense interest and growing determination. Australia began exploring similar strategies for reducing dependence on Chinese processing while maintaining access to Asian markets. Brazil commenced planning for infrastructure investments that would allow direct European access to South American resources without American intermediation. Norway investigated Arctic cooperation agreements that would strengthen both Canadian and Norwegian positions in future resource negotiations. The precedent was established, and the template was proven. Middle powers possessed more strategic options than they had previously recognized, but only if they were willing to make the infrastructure investments necessary to support independent economic relationships. Canada had demonstrated that patient strategy, combined with abundant resources and geographic advantages, could reshape continental power relationships permanently. The $180 billion Arctic investment was not a speculative gamble on uncertain outcomes. It was a calculated restructuring of North American economics that succeeded beyond any realistic American ability to reverse or contain. The infrastructure was operational and expanding. The trade relationships were diversified and strengthening. The psychological confidence was established and growing. The strategic precedent was set and spreading to other regions, where similar opportunities existed for nations willing to invest in independence rather than accepting permanent subordination. When I observe the complete scope of what Canada achieved between 2025 and 2026, I see something that transcends normal economic or diplomatic change. I see a middle power that refused to accept limitations that others tried to impose through assumption rather than necessity. I see a nation that leveraged geographic advantages and resource wealth to create strategic options that had seemed impossible until they became inevitable. The transformation reveals fundamental truths about power relationships in a multipolar world. Proximity does not guarantee permanent control. Resource dependence can be inverted through infrastructure investment. Patient strategy can overcome immediate disadvantages. Geographic advantages become geo-economic weapons when combined with sufficient capital and political will. The age of Canadian economic sovereignty represents more than a bilateral adjustment between neighbors. It represents a new model for how middle powers can achieve genuine independence in a world where traditional alignment choices no longer serve national interests effectively. Canada proved that independence was achievable for any nation willing to build it rather than simply declare it. The infrastructure was the sovereignty. The alternatives were the freedom. The patience was the strategy that made American opposition irrelevant rather than insurmountable. This transformation cannot be undone by future policy changes or diplomatic initiatives because it rests on physical capabilities rather than political agreements. The ports exist, the processing facilities operate, the shipping routes function, the trade